Hello everyone and welcome to the 2017 Leneen Ford Lecture. I'm Claire Tilbury and I'm the chairperson of the board of the Child Protection Practitioners Association of Queensland. We're privileged to have as our chair this evening Marilyn Strofel, Deputy Director General of the Department of Communities, Child Safety and Disability Services. Unfortunately, the advertised chair, the Director General of the Department, Michael Hogan, isn't able to attend because he's not well and he doesn't have a voice, so he sends his apologies. But we're really delighted that Marilyn's available. She's currently leading major reforms in child and family services in Queensland, mainly related to child protection and domestic and family violence. Marilyn, thanks very much for stepping in and chairing the event this evening. And also thank you for your support of Cppaq. We were really delighted to hear today that the department is providing some financial support for our events this year. And so we look forward to continuing to provide a range of multidisciplinary professional development events in the child protection field. So thanks, Marilyn, and over to you.
Good evening, everybody. Can I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet this evening and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. On behalf of the Child Protection Practitioners Association of Queensland, I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you all for attending this evening. I'd particularly like to acknowledge special guests, the Honourable Miss Leneen Ford, and I would also like to acknowledge guests this evening from the judiciary, the legal profession, government, community sector, as well as from the private sector. Thank you for showing your support for the Child Practitioners Association of Queensland. It's a great privilege to chair this important event. We're working towards having the strongest child protection system in Australia. Just 12 days ago, the Premier released 3 important reports undertaken by the Queensland Family and Child Commission. The Foster Care, Blue Card and Appelt reports provide vital information on how our systems to protect children are operating and make significant recommendations to further strengthen them. I'm proud to say that the Queensland Government has accepted all recommendations of those 3 reports and work is already underway in the department to ensure that these are actioned. These reports identified improvements that needed to be made around our Blue Card system, and that's why we'll be acting to toughen up background checks on prospective foster carers and improve training for them to ensure that they're appropriately matched to children in need. While the review of Queensland's Blue Card system found it was one of the strongest systems in Australia, we will work to modernise the application process. We're also working to ensure that child safety is adequately resourced across Queensland, and recruitment of almost 400 new child safety staff has commenced. These new positions will ensure that we have the ability to respond even faster to reports of child abuse and neglect. As the Deputy Director General, I'm committed to working with everyone to ensure that we're building the strongest child safety system that we can. And I'd like again to thank you for being here to learn and to help us on this journey. As Claire said, I'm happy to announce that the department has approved the allocation of $17,000 to the association, and these funds will assist to better support ongoing professional development across all disciplines in the child protection system. The annual public address, named in honour of the Honourable Leneen Ford, aims to encourage discussion and reflection on the child protection system so that we can ensure that any reforms are developed with the most up-to-date research and contemporary thinking about the rights of children and young people. Past events have attracted a number of prominent speakers covering thought-provoking topics, and tonight will be no exception. Tonight we will hear from Mr. Dale Murray. Dale has dedicated his working life to improving the educational experiences of marginalised young people. His particular focus is in the area of flexible education, firstly as a teacher at the Centre Education Program, the first flexible learning centre in Queensland, then as the principal Flexible Learning Centre Network, and now in his current role as Director, Edmund Rice Education Youth Plus. Youth Plus provides socially inclusive educational environments for disenfranchised young people in schools located around Australia. Dale is well known in Queensland, but the Youth Plus Schools Network goes nationwide, and Dale is a leader internationally in this field. Youth Plus works with community, non-government organisation, Catholic education officers and state and federal governments to re-engage young people who, for complex social reasons, are unable to maintain a connection with mainstream education services. Many people in the room know Dale for his contribution to education for young people in residential care facilities. Others might have seen him at a gig one night playing with the old folk rockers Pop Properly. Dale received a Churchill Fellowship in 2011 and was recently awarded an Australian Government Endeavour Fellowship to study First Nations education in Canada. Dale, we're delighted to have you as guest speaker, and I'd join you in, well, would you please join me in welcoming Dale to the podium?
Thanks very much for that welcome, and reminding me of my guitar playing days from many years ago. We'll go for a jam later, indeed. Okay, just as we begin, I would just like also to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay respects to elders past and present. And I love this poem from Jonathan Hill, which says, "Today we stand in footsteps millennia old. May we acknowledge the traditional owners whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since men and women awoke from the great dream. We honour the presence of these ancestors who reside in the imagination of this land and whose irrepressible spirituality flows through all creation." Can we also acknowledge the young people that we all work with and bring them into the room with us today? Acknowledge their amazing resilience and the choices that they make to engage and re-engage in education with us. Education is a belief in possibilities. It's a belief about knowledge systems. It is a belief in the capacities of ordinary humans. As educators, we must refuse to believe in anything in human nature and in various situations that condemns humans to poverty, dependence, weakness and ignorance. We must reject the idea that youth are confined to situations of fate, such as being born into a particular class, gender or race, and we must believe that teachers, youth workers and students can confront and defeat the forces that prevent students from living more fully and freely. Every school is a site of reproduction or a site of change. In other words, education can be liberating or it can domesticate and maintain domination. That's from Murray Battersby in a great book called Decolonising Education. As mentioned, for over 30 years I've worked in flexible education, firstly as a teacher, then principal, and more recently as my role as director with the Youth Plus Institute. The privilege of this career has been in the establishment of some 20 schools across Australia in consultation with their communities and the opportunity this creates for young people seeking education, plus a body of research with national and international colleagues who are working together to deepen the epistemologies of flexible learning. Today I'm going to have a conversation with you that's at the edges of these educational landscapes, such as the flexible learning centres, where we find evidence of innovation and advocacy for social justice, educational change and acquisition of rights. The spaces that cater for those outside the mainstream are spaces that by necessity are experimental, challenge dominant paradigms and offer habitats of learning, inclusion, decolonisation, justice and equity. These spaces also model practice that may be taken up in more mainstream environments. In fact, good practice is good practice anyway. Many first world nations have and continue to develop flexible learning options because of the alienation and exclusion brought about by a model of education that continues to disenfranchise those caught in poverty and colonial hegemony. I'll highlight some stories of young people who brought me into their trust and shared their journey with me. And I'll finish the conversation with questions related to how we socially, culturally, politically position children and young people. And I'll endeavour to do this by discussing the concept of childism. In my view, alienation and exclusion, i.e. the loss of rights as defined by our nation's commitment to the rights of the child, is brought because the state defines educational progress in terms of a neoliberal economic rational agenda of human capital, which regularly discards a cohort of young people considered not to be meeting the requirements of normal benchmarks, standardised testing, social norms, compliance, and what we might call as commonly accepted behaviours. There's a great quote here by some colleagues, Martin Mills, Glenn McGregor, Deborah Hayes and Kitty Tiratel. Whilst there are clearly some teachers in the mainstream schools that are passionate about social justice, current educational reforms continue to favour a neoliberal paradigm that works against implementing socially just practices in schools. These reforms, aptly referred to as GERM by Pasi Sahlberg, who was the architect of the Finnish education system, that is the global education reform movement, restrict notions of education reform to developing processes that facilitate prescribed curricula, enforced external testing, test-based accountabilities for teachers, students and schools, and narrowing of curriculum choices to focus on important core subjects, and narrowing of pedagogical strategies in favour of direct instruction so that learning goals may be guaranteed, and corporate management models of schools and the marketisation of education. So that reform movement's been happening in this country and around the world for the last 20 to 30 years, and we can see it particularly in the last 10 years or so in Australia. It is really against this backdrop that my journey began in 1988 in Logan City, nearly some 30 years ago, with young people in that satellite city who were experiencing poverty and all its associated conditions, that is stealing food, homelessness, exclusion and disconnection from adults as trusting supporters. If you don't mind, I'd like to bring a song for you now. This song was written with young people from Logan City in around 1988 or a bit later by a guy called Kev Carmody, and this one will be played for you by Tex Perkins. I'm not going to sing it or anything like that to you, so don't panic. So just have a look at your neighbour, have a look at them, so you can just close your eyes and have a listen to this, so we can bring the voices of young people through this song into this room.
food, junk food, foul food, chunder. McDonald's, Kentucky, Railroad Thunder. past the fibro power cords, hanging down from the burnout boards. Dope and drugs keep you stable. While couples screw on the table. On the south side. The dark side. South of the freeway, those Logan kids used to hang out at that trashed out Rooster and Ribs. Most nights you screw or fuck. With girlfriends, boyfriends, use the night. Hide their reality from society.
It was that Rooster and Ribs place where I was taken on my first meeting with young people in Logan in 1988. I went for a job interview in an old house beside the Logan council offices. And as I went into this old home, the person running the place said, "There's a group of young people next door, go and have a chat with them." I walked into the room next door in the old house and there was a whiteboard and I wrote Mr. Murray up on the board and turned around and they'd all disappeared, some out the window, some they just took off on me. I followed them out the back and sat down with them under a tree and I grabbed a guitar on the way out and I was showing off playing scales really fast, just thinking anything I could do that might engage this group of young people. That didn't work. What I did have though was a packet of Champion Ruby tobacco in my pocket, and in those days we all smoked. And one young person said, "If you give us a smoke, we'll talk to you." I don't advocate this as an educational pedagogy, but I was in a job interview, and so I gave them all a cigarette. We sat around for a bit. They weren't really interested in me that much, and the kind of leader of that group bailed me up and said, "You don't really understand us at all. You have absolutely no idea about us." And I said, "Well, I think I do. I think I understand what's going on for you." And he said, "You've got no idea. Come with us." So we walked and we went all through the back of Logan, across train lines and all that kind of stuff, and we ended up in that place, in that Rooster and Ribs, which was pretty much described as that song says. It was a mess. 5 of the 6 young people I was with that day were living in that place. That's where they'd been staying for a fairly long time. So we sat down in a circle and there on milk crates, and I started asking questions about school and what had happened for them, the disconnection to school, etc. And after a while, I kept asking more questions, and after a while, hands kept shooting up like we were in school. They were sort of sitting in school and we're having these sorts of conversations. It struck me then that this group of young people, although living in incredibly difficult circumstances, had an enormous amount of resilience, wanted an education, and we were talking about their experiences that have been through juvenile justice, the experiences of being in and out of care, etc. This went on for about 25 minutes or so, and I eventually ran out of cigarette papers, so they said I could go then, and dumped me. I went back to the house in Logan, asking to have the job interview, and the guy running the place at that stage says, "Yeah, that's fine, you can start tomorrow." So that was about 30 years ago. In many ways, that journey brings me to here today, a journey that I've tried to listen to young people's stories with empathy, trying to advocate for change at a grassroots level, and developing educational responses that foreground ways from domination to liberation. So as we progress this conversation tonight, I thought it might be valuable just to take a look at the current state of statistical play that we face in this country, or in Queensland. You probably can't see that very well, but because it's one of those snip things I did off a website, and there's far too much data. It's the worst sort of thing you can do on these things. But I will explain to you. It's the 2012 through to 2016 school disciplinary absences across the state. The figure in 2012 of short-term absences on the far left bottom talks about 54,000 or nearly 55,000 short-term absences. That's 1 to 5 day suspensions. 2016, 1 to 5 day suspensions, nearly 68,000 suspensions. 2012, exclusions and cancellations add up to around about close to 3,000 and a bit more in 2016. The next one is the 2016 figures. You might be able to see a bit better. So you can see that there is a large number of young people that experience short-term suspensions, long-term suspensions, and a number of thousands of young people that are experiencing exclusion and enrolment cancellations. In terms of young people in out-of-home care in Queensland, you'll note the increase from 2012 to 2016, up to nearly 9,000 young people now in out-of-home care. Proportions of the type of care, 88% in home-based care, about 7% in residential care, and 5% in other kinds of care. The next slide talks about proportions by identity, and you can see that roughly in 2016, the 9,000 figure, with the over-representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people being close to about 4,000 in out-of-home care. Some stats on young people in the juvenile detention system. You can read there yourself. Nearly 3,500 with at least one proven offence, nearly 1,300 on supervised community orders, and roughly about 180 or so young people on average daily snapshots in detention across the state. So if we take these concepts, these ideas one at a time, and we begin with education, we know that Australia is home to an ever-increasing number of young people who, for complex social, cultural, historical, political and economic reasons, are outside mainstream education. We know now that there are about 70,000 young people engaged in around 900 flexible learning or alternative education environments across the country, and potentially that many young people not engaged in anything across the country. We're challenged to fulfil the national aspirations under the Melbourne Education Declaration, that is to improve education outcomes for Indigenous youth and disadvantaged young Australians, and especially those from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and more fundamentally to fill young people's basic rights to education. We know that disconnection from education presents as a key factor in the establishment of pathways to increase long-term risk factors of unemployment, underemployment, mental health and wellbeing, life concerns and social disconnection. Yet within education we continue to employ suspension and exclusion, enrolment cancellation and under-enrolment policies as strategies for managing young people. And as discussed, in Queensland in 2016 there were some 68,000 short-term suspensions, nearly 3,000 long-term suspensions, nearly 1,500 exclusions and 1,300 enrolment cancellations. Statistics on under-enrolment are really difficult to obtain, and we are aware of young people, and particularly those in out-of-home care, who are on 1 to 2 hour per day enrolments. Our experience within our work sees all of our centres see an oversubscription in terms of referrals and increasing referrals for a younger cohort. We are now regularly contacted regarding the enrolment of young people from lower, middle and upper primary schools. My experience over the past 30 years in the development and support of responses aimed at engagement is a direct result of invitations from communities attempting to ensure rights to education for disenfranchised young people in their communities. And as seen on the map in this state, those communities are in remote regions, up in Mount Isa, regional regions, Townsville, Rocky, Gympie, and urban settings, Ipswich, Brisbane, Southport, Deception Bay, Hemet, Inala, Noosa and Logan City. And we have conversations currently underway for a number of new locations. Along with our work and within Edmund Rice Education Australia, there are other agencies developing similar responses. In the main, these responses are developed from invitation from communities seeking to support those young people to access their fundamental right to education. So who are the young people we're talking about? They're young people with families that are caught in poverty. They are young people impacted by trauma, including intergenerational trauma. They are young people and families caught in underemployment and underemployment. They are young people and families who have generational histories of leaving school early, and they are young people who have mental health issues, depression and anxiety. Young people who are engaging in self-harming behaviours, young people who have substance abuse issues and alcohol and drugs, young people who are homeless, young people in contact with the juvenile justice systems, young people in care of the department, and young people who have repeatedly suffered from severe negative schooling experiences, as indicated there. They are young people who have been excluded and had repeated suspensions from school, young people with a history of extended periods of unexplained absences, young people that have not transitioned from primary schools, young people that are highly mobile, and young people who have family responsibilities, caring for others. A common theme among the young people seeking alternative educational pathways is a deep sense of alienation and disconnection. Many young people that have experienced multiple suspensions talk about a lack of trust with adults, not being heard, not having been afforded a sense of natural justice, and being pushed out. The relational space created within the flexible learning kinds of environments is an intentional effort to create spaces that offer pushed out students a safe space to reorganise their futures and deal with an often traumatised past with the support of mentors and educators. In this way, centres offer a challenge to the educational paradigm of suspension and exclusion and act as a lighthouse for practice while paving the way for what educational inclusivity and equity can look and feel like. As such, a fundamental repositioning of young people and adults in an educational landscape occurs wherein the educational landscape adapts to support the young person rather than the young person being required to adapt to the system. As part of this repositioning and as a point of advocacy, I believe the time has come to suspend suspensions, exclude exclusions and counsel enrolment cancellations as a policy framework. Surely it is surely it is a responsibility of the more experienced other, the educator and its associated systems, to review, rethink and replace policy that directly disenfranchises young people. I would argue it is the responsibility of the systems to ensure that the rights of young people are upheld, as in these rights that we have signed up to as a nation. Another consideration is the group of young people that fall outside these suspension and exclusion numbers. That is, those that simply just slip away, passively disconnect from education. Our services meet many such young people who for complex reasons quietly left primary schools and did not transition to high schools. Many of these young people seek out flexible learning educational pathways as they grow older, but again have missed many years of access to knowledge and the social connection that school brings. If we turn now to young people experiencing out-of-home care and their connection with education, for many years we've engaged with a variety of providers of out-of-home care services seeking to enhance the support for young people's engagement with education. This has taken a number of forms. A collective agency paper called Education Matters and its working group research identified many of the challenges faced by children and young people in care. It specifically identifies the barriers to achieving good educational outcomes, and that working group identified 6 main reasons why children and young people are disengaged from education. They are instability in schools. A history of disrupted schooling attendance is common for children and young people in care. Instability in schools occurs due to placement changes, suspensions and exclusions, plus challenges associated with disability and learning, emotional and behavioural difficulties. These multiple changes of home and school disrupt regular school attendance and negatively impact on a child's potential for academic achievement. Reports going back to 2009 from the then Commissioner of Children and Young People in Queensland and in relationship to residential care and children in foster care found that 5 or more primary schools were attended by 30% of young people in residential care. So this is from 2008-2009, just hold that figure. And 26% of children in foster care attended more than 3 primary schools. And as you would know, some people in foster care reported to attend up to more than 20 primary schools. Further disruption to school meant that many children and young people in residential care do not attend school for around 12 months, leading to lower levels of attainment compared to peers of the same age. In terms of problems with schools, children and young people in care face multiple problems at schools, compounded by their family circumstances and maintained in often unsupportive social environments. Normalisation in daily life, being the same as everybody else, is one of the most important factors to improving educational outcomes. Yet the social stigma of being in care inflicted through negative stereotyping and discrimination is routinely experienced, and about 40% of young people in resi cares reported having been made to feel different and most of the times that they have been in care. In terms of limited educational attendance, and the report cited difficulties in engagement and retaining children and young people in the mainstream school system often result in compounding wide-ranging social issues and self-harming behaviours. This makes it difficult for young people to get back into the education and particularly to re-enter community life. Educational opportunities for young people in residential care are particularly concerning. The report found that 72% of young people in residential care reported they were attending school. So that meant 28% of young people in residential care weren't attending school. Poor academic performance. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare study highlights the effect of educational disadvantage experienced by children in care. Children and young people in care scored significantly lower on NAPLAN results, particularly in years 3, 5 and 7. And moreover, the lower test scores are experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young peoples, potentially because the tests themselves aren't that culturally appropriate. These levels of disadvantage is notionally equivalent to the absence of around 8 to 12 months of education. And finally, other barriers to accessing further education. The transition to independent living from school is more rapid for children and young people in care and often occurs at a younger age than their mainstream peers. Peers that have an option to return home repeatedly, an option not open to children in care. Many young people leaving care face hardship and trauma in the journey to independence and experience poorer social and economic outcomes. When already faced with the handicap of lower educational outcomes and unresolved and emotional and physical problems, children and young people in care experience a greater risk of homelessness, unemployment, poverty, early parenthood, substance abuse, poor mental health and physical health, and involvement in crime. School disruption often results in children losing their place in their curriculum, repeating some curriculum components while not receiving others. And as children move through stages of education and development, they fall further behind, potentially limiting their educational outcomes, further employment prospects and the ability to participate successfully in society. So despite many interventions in this space over the past years, and we can cite here things like the More Than Safe program by the Family and Children's Commissioner here in Queensland, and our ongoing partnership with a national care agency that supports a number of educational consultants whose role it is to advocate for young people in care with schools, we continue to see these challenges, and I'm sure many in this room can see the same challenges. We are then, and this came off the Families and Children's Commission website and some fast facts, and why I ask you to hold that other thought in your head. Almost 30% of, this is 2017 facts, almost 30% of Queensland children who left care in 2014-15 experienced 4 or more placements. Yep, a significant group of children out of home care experience more severe and ongoing levels of placement and instability, and more than 7 placements. So there's this constant, persistent state of where young people in care are not experiencing the same educational outcomes as their peers. These challenges bring into stark reality the complexity of maintenance to the fidelity to the Queensland Child Protection Act, particularly Section K, that highlights for children's development, education, emotional health and intellectual needs to be met as part of the Act. And I'm sure people in this room have looked at that Act and looked at what's happening for young people in care. Our partnerships continue to witness children and young people in out-of-home care experiencing the similar kinds of things of instability in school, problems at school, limited educational outcomes, poor academic performance, co-occurrence of educational and health problems and financial barriers to accessing education. We are weekly reminded of the fact that of the increasing number of young people being shifted to 1 to 2 hour per day enrolments. So young people being asked to be, and very young people, on 1 to 2 hours a day enrolment. We're also reminded of the complexity of traumatised young people face as they attempt to engage with education settings. We also are very aware of the care to custody pathway that some young people have faced. So, the overrepresentation of children from out-of-home care in our criminal justice system is a matter of long-standing concern. And a recent Victorian Child Commission data found that almost 1 in 3 young people with child protection matters who were placed in out-of-home care came back seeking legal assistance. Young people placed in out-of-home care are almost twice as likely to face criminal charges as those who remain with their families, and young people placed in out-of-home care are more likely than other young children to be charged with criminal damages for property-related offences. The report I cite here goes on to talk about the lawyers see cases where police have been called to a residential facility to deal with behaviour by a young person that would unlikely come to the attention of the police had it occurred in a family home. They have represented children from residential care who received criminal charges for smashing a cup, throwing a sink plug, or spreading food around the kitchen. Further, they go on to cite, and we've seen this and witnessed this in our own work. Frequently, children who have never had a criminal charge prior to entering care quickly acquire a lengthy criminal history due to the cycle of acting out. So, as you will be aware, these situations occur in Queensland and around the country. Of those in custody, we know that these figures exist. Broken them down a bit further, there's around, as I said, 186 young people in detention currently, on average, about 110 or so in Brisbane and about 61 up in Townsville. There are around about 15 young people in detention who are between 10 to 13 years of age. 12 of those 15 on average are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, and 13 of those 15 are young people who are on remand. The daily snapshot then is these stats. 78% of the charges on young people in detention are remanded in custody. 69% are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people, and 80% of the young people in care had experiences of out-of-home care. The telling percentage here is, of course, the 80% of young people in detention that have experienced out-of-home care, again pointing to the care to custody pathway. We can see from these snapshots persistent and alarming statistics in relationship to care, protection and education of young people, particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people and young people from low socioeconomic backgrounds within our state. The question arises, what are the social conditions allowing a strong liberal democracy like ours to continue to treat young people and children in ways that fundamentally challenge their basic rights when, as adults, we have a responsibility to attend to the positive futures for young people? Arguing that we attend to positive futures in the present is not an argument for controlling young people and training them for futures that have been pre-made and instrumentally determined, particularly given the rapid changing world of work and unpredictable futures young people will face. It is instead recognition of the ways in which adults are socially and morally responsible for mediating the world for and with young people on a relational level through institutions created to provide positive developmental experiences for children and young people. Arguing that we should attend to children and young people reminds us that we have a responsibility to acknowledge when and how we attend to this, and that we can attend in ways that are enabling, in ways that ensure educative, expansive responses rather than miseducative, reductionist experiences, for example, suspensions, exclusions, under-enrolment, remand, etc. It also reminds us that our capacity to attend is shaped through relationships with young people. Relationships that include a unique tension between various forms of agency and vulnerability. Essentially, to this tension, that is, we learn from young people about their experiences, we listen to their voice, and we value their perspectives. John Wall, in his 2010 publication In Ethics in the Light of Childhood, and Elizabeth Young-Bruhl in her 2012 publication Childism, both note a general disregard for children and youth that is coupled with a perspective on child development and an adult-centric view of the world that reduces childhood to a prolonged stage of immaturity, in essence, a deficit view of young people. The two offer different yet potentially complementary definitions of childism. In an attempt to raise awareness of the lack of rights made available to children as a group, sometimes abbreviated as the rights of provision, protection and participation under the rights of children in the UN, understanding both definitions of childhood may help us understand the work that must be done to attend more equitably to young people and, in turn, our society and for ourselves as adults. From the perspective of Young-Bruhl, childism parallels racism, classism, sexism and other isms that highlight cultural prejudice in our societies. Like other isms, childism is a prejudice that affects children as a group. It is the most difficult form of prejudice to recognise because children are commonly considered to be naturally subordinate. Childism, however, is complex because it is not defined, discussed and studied as a prejudice like other isms, sexism or racism. It has not become a concept used in policy or political discourse, in research, and it is not broken into individual or collective imaginations in ways that enable consciousness raising, dialogue, deliberation and change in action. Young-Bruhl argues that such a focus could guide exploration for how and why adults fail to meet children's needs and respect their rights. We can ask why children as young as 10 are imprisoned, held in remand, excluded from schools. As we know too well in this state, there are young people in detention at the age of 10. There are young people being excluded and suspended from schools at ages of 6, 7 and 8. There are some young people who experience multiple barriers to positive futures while in care, and why young people remain in poverty and are forced to steal food to survive in a country that has perceived strong nets of social support. We need to look for the underlying social causes when adults fail children, and little effort has been made to combat what can be argued is a prejudice that rationalises and legitimates maltreatment and disenfranchisement of children. Here we may point to the legacy of colonisation and class stratification as fundamental to the underlying social causes that are firmly rooted in our cultural, social, economic and political foundations. However, naming a prejudice is just the beginning. The next step is to hear, listen to, value and respect the voices and experiences of children and youth, to learn from and try to understand their perspective and context, to provide an intentional common ground of relationship. Attending to possible futures in the present relies on the perspective that, while recognising that children and youth are different, does not see children and youth as deficit or in a state of subordination. Such a perspective would see children and youth as dynamic, developing and changing, and value their contributions in an accept, build and yes and kind of way. The second view of childism, offered by Wall, parallels the concept of humanism rather than racism. This perspective of childism suggests that the experience of children become a new lens transforming how do we find, understand and practice moral engagement, and in turn the maintenance and development of shared rights. Through an understanding of children and youth, adults can recover the depth of human experience that we may have willingly set aside. Like Young-Bruhl, Wall is compelled by the problematic situations of childhood in an unstable and hyper-individualistic world that includes diverse cultural, political and economic landscapes. Regarding child poverty, they ask, why did children overtake the elderly in the mid-20th century as the poorest aged group in society, so that a quarter of its children now live in poverty? Wall claims that the solution to such problems is not simply to pay more attention, nor is it to provide children more kinds of rights, provisions and protections, freedoms and responsibilities that are able to be enjoyed to a greater extent by adults. Such solutions are helpful but not fully sufficient. A truly child-centred inclusive society would be one that not only made children equal to adults but more radically transformed its foundations. It would reform its fundamental prepositions about what makes good lives and relationships in the first instance. Wall's childism is adult self-critique, a method that enables adults to reflect on their thoughts and actions, to be wary of adult-centric views, to elicit the unique ways in which children and youth perceive and experience the world as a foundation for a new moral project. In essence, a complete repositioning of young people and the adult relationship, one where adult and young person equity is paramount. Isms can be blunt and powerful ideological tools. They can help change structures, cultures and possibilities. While this perspective on childism also argues for a better understanding of experiences of children and youth as different from adults, the purpose is not to raise awareness of the prejudiced, but rather to expand the possibilities for moral action for all human beings, young and old. Both forms of childism as a prejudice and childism as expansion of human moral engagement, call for a profound ethical restructuring of relationships and the social institutions that bear responsibility for children and young people. These include schools, systems of care, systems of justice, systems of health and legal systems. The growing suite of flexible learning options across this nation, and particularly here in Queensland, are in many ways beginning to explore the potential of this restructure of relationships, evidenced by models of practice that promote a sense of common ground. The model that we are developing and have been working on points to 4 areas of intersection that design our work in ways that promote rights and corresponding responsibilities. In the centre, the set of values: emotional development, intellectual development, spiritual development and physical development. This centre draws on First Nations knowledges of ways of being, i.e. medicine wheels, circles of knowing. Outlying the values are the principles, in essence relationship guides. Emphasis is on staff and young people relationships, trauma-informed practice, relationship theory and practice, and individually and group-focused responsibilities. Moving out further to the third lever is this sort of zone of learning. This draws on the Vygotskian zone of proximal development theories, where we acknowledge young people's capitals when they arrive and the challenges, and we offer challenge moving in and out of capitals to challenge and back to capitals as members grow and scaffold. And the fourth circle is the sense of common ground that we share. Group theory and practice, social inclusion and social justice. This fourth circle shares our commitment to sharing power. In terms of young people that we've worked with, there's a wonderful story of a young woman who was with us for many years at the school I ran in Logan City. And she left us after being with us for about 3 years. She was in care and had travelled a really hard journey with us. She moved out when she was about 17 on her own with a young fellow that she'd met in care, and they moved into a home or a flat in Logan. The relationship was a really complex relationship with a fair bit of violence in it. The relationship broke down in the end and they broke up and she left, but she came back and told us the story of how that she'd used those 4 principles: respect, safety, participation and honesty as a moral compass for their own lives together, and she put those principles up around in her home as a way of trying to corral their relationship. It didn't work for the young man. He ended up going to jail in the end. However, what she talked about was, for the first time in her life, she actually found a set of values, a set of words that could give her some way of dealing with the future. So this kind of understanding of a moral perspective that is given through an education system is paramount. So this relational pedagogy foregrounds an educational landscape that responds to prejudice as described by Wall and Young-Brule in their versions of childism. This flexible learning sector is growing in response to increased community invitation and in spite of increased structural complexity that continues to disenfranchise those most at risk. Our experience of those most at risk, those in care, those excluded and suspended, those on the custody pathway and caught in cycles of poverty, is an experience of amazing resilience of young people seeking ways to engage in their own right, ways to have their voices heard, and ways to challenge us as adults to listen and see the world from a different point of view. If a nation's maturity is measured on how it treats its most at risk, younger and older Australians, those with less access to economic security, differently abled, those from diverse cultural backgrounds and sexual orientations, then our nation since colonisation may be classified as very young, in fact immature. Continued leadership, research and advocacy is called for to claim the collective rights, educational, cultural and social equity that is the right of each young person, no matter their postcode. Wall challenges us to open individual and societies to previously unimagined moral possibilities that if engaged with, we may see transformation in this nation's maturity with regard to its most valuable asset, children and young people. Thanks for your attention, thanks for your empathy and thanks for your compassion and your work you do.
Thank you, Dale. That was absolutely thought-provoking and challenging. I was sharing with Dale before we started tonight that I'm fairly new to child protection, and a few years ago I was very privileged to sit beside Obama's performance advisor at dinner, and I said, what would be the one thing that you would measure to see the success of a child protection system? And I was expecting to hear something about reunifications or decreasing number of children coming into care. She said to me, just make sure that any kid you touch finishes school. Yeah. So I think she was a very smart woman, and it's a challenge that I have put to all of our people who work in child protection is let's make sure that our kids finish school because at least they've got a fighting chance. So thank you, Dale. I think that you've given us a lot to think about. That does conclude the formal part of our evening tonight. We do invite you to join us for drinks in the foyer, but just before we go, I would like to thank our sponsors for tonight. I'd also like to thank the Chief Judge for the use of the Banco Court. So thanks very much, everybody.